everyone, my name is Andrea, and today I'm going to be speaking for the Change Schools TCK Summit. Firstly, a big thank you to Saloni and Grace for inviting me to be a part of this. This month's topic for the TCK Summit is how do we as TCKs use our unique experiences and worldviews to drive change for social good? I've asked a number of questions, but let's kick off with the first one, which is essentially my TCK story. When people ask where I'm from, they never get a short answer. I'm Swedish, but I grew up in 6 different countries. So I'd say I'm not only culturally malleable, I'm pretty culturally confused as well. I was born in Peru and lived in Italy, Thailand, Hong Kong, Holland, Singapore, and ended up there by the time I was 13. So the bulk of my formative years were spent in Singapore. My brother and I went to a variety of schools, from local village nurseries to huge international schools with an American curriculum as well as British curriculums. I had a brief stint back in Europe for about a year and a half when I was 12, and this was in Holland. I remember feeling very displaced and very foreign, despite the fact that I was residing in a country more similar to Sweden than anywhere else. And that's precisely why I felt so alien, I think. It was so different to what I was used to, which was a childhood in Asia. The topic of this month is really interesting to me because I feel that everyone, regardless of their background, should be thinking about how they can incorporate something of value to social or environmental causes. As TCKs, many of us have grown up in environments where we've been exposed to various issues like poverty, environmental disasters such as typhoons or droughts, and we've witnessed firsthand how individuals really can make a difference. You don't have to be working for the Red Cross or WWF. A grassroots effort in your own community can make a real difference. I've grown up seeing how educating one girl in a rural Asian family can improve the livelihood of an entire village by setting a new precedent in the importance of schooling. Many people feel that charitable or philanthropic work is only effective on a mass scale, but that's simply not true. When you see firsthand how the domino effect works, it's pretty amazing. So now we're going to kick off with some questions posed to me by the TCK Summit group. And the first one is a TCK the same as a global citizen? Why or why not? In my mind, my definition of the term global citizen is really very different to what a TCK is. In this day and age, globalization, the internet, as well as cheap airfare has made an international life possible, and I see more and more people with multiple home bases that travel between different cities. This was unthinkable just a few decades ago, but it's definitely becoming the norm. One can be a global citizen by traveling and working in different countries as an adult and being immersed and exposed to new cultures and learning a new way of life. I think the insights and experiences that you take away from this kind of exposure when you're mature are very different to the ones that are imparted onto you as a child. A third culture kid has grown up in a culture different to that of his nationality or heritage. And I feel that when you're exposed to a different world from a young age, these experiences really shape your view of the world and how you interact with people. It's a complete mindset programming that occurs when you're shaping and forming your personality as a young person. Your cross-cultural sensitivity becomes deeply embedded within you. And there are certainly personality traits that are common across TCKs, like heightened interpersonal skills, adaptability, cultural intelligence. The next question is, do you see any differences between TCKs in Asia and the rest of the world? Do TCKs in Asia feel a greater calling to do good? Speaking from a very personal experience in terms of the people that I've interacted with, I do think there's a difference when it comes to those who've grown up in developing countries versus developed ones, especially in Asia and Africa. In Asia, we're often confronted with the realities of people whose lives are not as privileged as ours. This even happens on a daily basis right in front of your very eyes. A lot of us in Asia grew up with domestic helpers at home and got an insight into their lives and that of their children. Another example I'd like to mention is one from my childhood in Bangkok. We lived in a house on a small side street in the center of town, and sometimes a roaming elephant and his mahout would wander by. Sounds like a childhood dream come true, but in actual fact, the mahout was desperate for money and had fled the countryside because there was no work for him. He wandered the streets trying to make a quick buck from tourists. His sadness and that of his elephant was palpable, and even at the age of 4, I remember knowing that there was something wrong and that this beautiful creature should not be trapped in an urban hell. It sparked a great deal of questioning and taught me a lesson about wildlife preservation, and has sparked a lifelong love for protecting animals. My mother also worked with a Thai charity that supported the blind, and I remember going with her to meet and play with blind kids and adults from the age of 4 to 8 on a regular basis. Another childhood memory that sticks out in my head is a trip that we took to Beijing when I was 9. And after a day of sightseeing, we caught a rickshaw back to the hotel. The man who was pedaling the bicycle on the rickshaw was really, really old, thin, and frail. And I remember bursting into tears and getting really upset that this man had to work so hard to ferry us around when the old people that I knew in Sweden were taken care of by the government. There were social benefits, and they didn't have to do manual labor to make sure that they had food on the table. The differences between the haves and the have-nots are so obvious in these countries that it's impossible to ignore. I also went to a school here in Singapore that made community service a part of its curriculum. I taught underprivileged kids reading skills and organized a project to deliver school supplies to a remote learning center in the Himalayas of Nepal. The reason I talk about these experiences is that they really stuck with me, and I know that it's the same for many of my peers. You really don't forget them, and it becomes ingrained within you to consider what's going on around you and what you can do to help. I've met other TCKs from Western countries, and empathy definitely seems to be a uniting trait amongst all TCKs, regardless of which continent they grew up on. In terms of the ones that end up in philanthropy as a career or doing some part-time work in their free time, I've definitely noticed that the majority of my friends incorporate some form of this work into their lives. The last 3 companies I've worked for have been really small businesses, but each of them had some kind of a giving back scheme, whether it was employing someone with autism, providing pro bono work for charities, or fundraising. And 2 out of these 3 initiatives were started by a TCK from Asia. I can't really speak for TCKs who've grown up outside of Asia, as I have less of them to pull. But again, as I said earlier, I do think that there's an overarching empathy gene that's imparted into TCKs. The next question is a new term needed to describe TCKs in this part of the world? Personally, I don't think so. I like the unifying umbrella term TCKs. They're my tribe, and if you really want to differentiate, you can say TCKs who grew up in Asia, TCKs who grew up in South America, or whatever. Otherwise, I feel we'd have a zillion acronyms that we'd never be able to remember. How can we define or understand the complexity and multi-dimensions of third culture kids in Asia? This is a tough one. I think there are a huge number of factors to consider. A lot depends on the amount of time spent in the different countries and at what age, whether you learned the local language, etc. Then you also have the TCKs who hold multiple passports, as their parents might be different or dual nationalities, and that adds even more to the mix. For example, a friend of mine who was born to a Japanese mother and an American father grew up in Thailand, attending international school. He speaks better Thai than he does Japanese. Going to America for uni didn't feel like going home, and when he visits Japan, he certainly feels affection for it, but home is Bangkok, where he grew up. He juggles all of these different identities, playing baseball with dad, eating ramen with mom, celebrating Songkran, which is the Thai New Year, with local friends, and comparing flight booking websites with his expat gang. But some TCKs don't even have the luxury of having a home base as such. Another friend of mine is half English and half Indian. Her family moved every 2 to 4 years, which wasn't really long enough to pick up the language in any place. And when this is the only life you know, this kind of nomadic lifestyle, it does beg the question, where is home? What is home? And for many, it's wherever your suitcase is parked at the moment. That's certainly true for me. I'm Swedish, but I never lived there at all because my parents left before I was born. And although I spent time in Europe and South America, the bulk of my formative years were spent in Asia, in Thailand, Singapore, and Hong Kong. I feel really comfortable and at home in all of these countries, and yet I still feel like there's an element of not being fully integrated due to the language barrier. But I am fully integrated into a subsection of the expatriate scene. The difference between me and other expats is that the expat scene is kind of my home turf, whereas for many others it's just a temporary stopping off point. Two of my Swedish friends from high school in Singapore moved back to Stockholm and have happily settled back into life there. But they had spent a number of childhood years there already, so their time in Singapore was sort of a brief hiatus from Swedish life, essentially. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about integration. Do you see more integration or assimilation in this region versus other parts? Going back to my earlier point, I really do think it depends on how much time you've spent in this country, or whichever host country you're referring to, what age you were, and whether the local language is learned. As well as, where in Asia are you? It's certainly much, much more easy to integrate here in Singapore, which is relatively westernized, and English is widely spoken. Your lifestyle and food choices can remain similar to what they are back home. If you were to move to Dhaka and Bangladesh, it's obviously going to be harder to assimilate. I do feel like my circle of friends here are really integrated, especially because a number of them are actually half Asian or half Singaporean. And because of this level of integration, I do see that there's more awareness and more action to combat social issues. I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening.